The battlefield stretched endlessly before him, a graveyard of shattered bodies and twisted metal. The sky was choked with smoke, and the ground was thick with blood from countless soldiers who had fought and died here. Silence followed the storm of battle, but for the wounded warrior, it was far from peaceful. His body lay broken among the dead, his armor cracked and useless, exposing wounds that refused to stop bleeding. Pain throbbed through every nerve, but it was nothing compared to the weight of betrayal that settled in his chest. He had fought bravely. His blades had tasted the blood of enemies, but it wasn't enough. The enemy was relentless, overwhelming, and even the strongest among his kind had fallen. He was supposed to be the fiercest of them all, but now, as his vision blurred and his body weakened, his mind could only replay the moment they left him. His own squad had barely glanced his way when the enemy's final attack had hit, crippling him. They didn't care. The moment he fell, he was worthless in their eyes. Weak. Disposable. It was the Cruxer way. Strength was everything. You fought, you survived, or you died. And the wounded? They were left to rot. He had seen it happen to others, and now it was happening to him. The Cruxer didn't mourn the fallen, didn't bother with the weak. Emotion was a luxury, and compassion was a myth. His body convulsed with a weak attempt at movement, but the pain shot through him like fire. He could feel the blood leaking from his side, pooling beneath him. His mind drifted back to his training, to the harsh lessons that had been drilled into him since he was a hatchling. Strength is survival. The weak are left behind. He thought of his brothers, the ones who had trained beside him, who had laughed with him in moments of victory. Where were they now? Did they even care? No, they had done what was expected. He was no longer useful, no longer a warrior. He was nothing. His vision darkened, and for a moment, he welcomed it. Death would be a release from the shame of being abandoned. His kind would not even bother to recover his body. He would be forgotten, a nameless casualty in the endless war that stretched across the stars. It was the way of the Cruxer. He should have known it would end this way. But as the darkness closed in, there was movement. Shadows passed over him, and he could hear footsteps, the low murmur of voices. His heart raced, though his body was too weak to respond. They had come back for him? No. His people would never return. The figures grew closer, their language strange, unfamiliar. Humans. He recognized them through the haze of pain and exhaustion. The enemy. They moved carefully across the battlefield, their faces grim as they searched for survivors. He tensed, or tried to, though his body could barely muster the strength to breathe, let alone fight. The humans moved closer. One of them, a soldier wearing a dusty uniform, knelt beside him, checking his pulse. They were speaking, but the words were lost in the roaring of his own blood in his ears. He expected them to finish him off. His own people had left him to die, surely the enemy would do no less. Perhaps they would see it as a mercy. But then something unexpected happened. The human didn't draw his weapon. He didn't call for the others to execute him. Instead, the soldier pulled a small medical kit from his pack, hands working quickly as he started tending to the alien's wounds. The warrior's mind screamed in confusion. Why? Why would they help him? It made no sense. His people would have left them for dead without a second thought. To the Cruxer, mercy was a weakness. Yet here, in the heart of the battlefield, among the corpses of friends and foes alike, the humans, his enemies, were saving him. The pain dulled as the human applied a strange salve to his wounds, and another soldier handed him water. He didn't drink, not at first. Suspicion gnawed at him, even in his weakened state. But his body betrayed him, desperate for hydration. He drank, though it tasted like defeat. The soldiers were speaking again. The leader of their group, a man with tired eyes but a firm stance, looked down at him and said something the warrior couldn't understand. But he could see the look in their eyes, the hesitation of some, the resolve in others. They had made a decision. He didn't know why, but they had decided to keep him alive. A part of him wanted to protest, to tell them he wasn't worth saving. His comrades hadn't thought so. His people would never have done the same. Weakness was a death sentence, and he had been weak. He had failed. But the humans didn't seem to care. They lifted him, carefully, and began carrying him away from the battlefield, away from the death and the blood and the silent judgment of his people. He didn't know what to feel. Rage? Shame? Gratitude? No. None of that mattered. What mattered was that they hadn't left him behind. They hadn't abandoned him. The air was cool against his skin as they moved, and the world around him began to blur again. Darkness pulled at the edges of his vision, but it wasn't the same suffocating weight as before. This time, there was a strange sense of calm. He couldn't understand why the humans had done this. To his people, weakness was unforgivable. Yet here he was, alive, because they had chosen to save him. The humans had carried him into a makeshift shelter, a small outpost on the edge of the battlefield. His wounds still throbbed, but they had stabilized him, stopped the bleeding. He lay on a cold surface, feeling the strange tension in the air. The humans were talking, though they likely didn't think he could understand. They were arguing. He could hear it in the tone of their voices, the way it rose and fell. Some wanted to leave him behind. He was their enemy, after all. A Cruxer warrior, a being bred for violence, who had likely killed many of their own. Why save him? Why risk their lives and their resources for someone who would have left them to die without a second thought? One soldier spoke louder than the others, his voice full of frustration. The words were hard to make out, but the meaning was clear. He didn't trust the alien, and he wasn't shy about voicing it. Yet the commanding officer's tone was different, steadier. There was a firmness in his voice, an unwavering sense of purpose. To abandon a life, even an enemy's, went against everything they stood for. He reminded them that they weren't just soldiers, they were human. And being human meant something. They would not become like the Cruxer, who discarded their wounded without mercy. The alien warrior tried to process this. Why would they care? Why argue over his life? He wasn't one of them, and by the values he had been raised with, he didn't deserve their help. He felt a flicker of something unfamiliar, something that gnawed at his pride. Weakness. He hated the sensation of lying helpless while they debated whether his life was worth saving. Soon, they returned to his side. The medic, a younger human with a quiet demeanor, leaned over him and continued to clean his wounds. The alien's mind raced, trying to understand. He wanted to reject the care, to spit at the notion that he needed help from these humans. His kind would have let him rot. His people would have seen him as unworthy of aid. But here, the hands of his enemies worked with care, mending the wounds that should have ended his life. Why? He searched their faces, but there was no malice. Only a strange sense of duty, as if saving him was simply the right thing to do. The alien felt a surge of resentment. This wasn't how things worked. His people believed in power, in domination. The weak fell, the strong thrived. It was a clear, uncompromising law of existence. And yet here he was, being spared, being healed by those who had every reason to let him die. The medic spoke softly, words the alien couldn't fully grasp, but there was a gentleness to the voice that unsettled him. The human wasn't afraid, wasn't treating him like a threat. For the first time, the alien looked beyond the physical acts of care. There was something else at play here, something deeper than he could understand. What made them different? What drove them to protect even an enemy? He remained silent, feeling the tension between his beliefs and the reality before him. He should have pushed them away, rejected their kindness. Weakness was shameful, and accepting help was weakness. But his body betrayed him. He needed them, whether he wanted to admit it or not. The humans worked in silence now, the arguments fading away. The commanding officer had made his decision, and it seemed final. They would save him. As they moved around the small outpost, the alien began to observe them more closely. The way they spoke to each other, the way they shared supplies and food, the unspoken bond that connected them. It was strange. He'd never seen his own kind act this way. Among the Cruxer, warriors fought for themselves, for their own glory. Even in battle, they were alone. Every warrior was expected to fend for themselves. There was no room for weakness, no room for reliance on others. But these humans, they fought for each other. They cared for each other. Even here, in the midst of war, they treated each other with a kind of loyalty the alien had never witnessed. It made him uneasy. He couldn't fathom this kind of strength. To his people, strength was a personal measure. But these humans, their strength wasn't just physical. It was something else. Something unsettling. A strength that came from unity, from compassion. The alien had never known such concepts, not in any meaningful way. His people didn't need each other. At least, that's what he'd been taught. The medic returned to his side, offering him water. The alien hesitated, his pride fighting with the reality of his situation. His throat was dry, his body weak. Slowly, reluctantly, he drank. The human watched him carefully, their eyes meeting for a brief moment. It wasn't a look of superiority, or even pity. Just understanding. It made the alien feel more exposed than he had ever felt in his life. Time passed, and as the alien warrior lay there, he began to question everything. What if strength wasn't just about power, about survival at any cost? What if there was more to it than brute force and domination? The idea was foreign, almost painful to consider. His entire existence had been built on the belief that strength was singular, a solitary pursuit. But now, these humans were showing him something else. They fought for more than themselves. They fought for each other. And they didn't just fight. They healed, they protected, even their enemies. It was a strength he didn't understand, and it terrified him. He wanted to reject it. To cling to the cold, unyielding values of his people. But deep down, a part of him, a part he hadn't known existed, wondered if maybe, just maybe, his people were wrong. That thought alone was enough to shake him to his core. The days blurred together as he lay in the shelter, his body slowly regaining strength. Each breath felt less like a battle and more like a reminder that he was still alive. The humans had not left his side, their determination to see him healed as steadfast as ever, even though they had their own struggles. Their supplies were meager, their mission undoubtedly delayed because of him. And yet not once did they question their choice. They kept him alive, patching his wounds with what little they had, sharing their rations, and ensuring he was stable before tending to themselves. It was confusing, maddening even. The alien warrior had expected them to abandon him once the immediate danger had passed. In his world, no one would sacrifice for the weak. And yet these humans, beings he had once seen as soft, inferior, were proving to be far more resilient than he had anticipated. They were not strong in the way he had been taught to understand strength. They were not brutal, not ruthless. But there was a different kind of power in them, a power he couldn't yet fully grasp. It lingered in the way they looked out for each other, the way they made sure everyone was fed, even when resources were running low. He began to watch them more closely as he regained mobility, though his body still ached from the injuries. They worked tirelessly, a tight-knit unit that moved in unison. Each man and woman had a role, and no one was left behind. If someone faltered, another would pick them up. It was a dynamic he had never seen among his own kind. Cruxer fought alone, lived alone, died alone. The idea of strength being collective was a foreign concept to him, and yet, it was undeniable in the way these humans operated. He found himself questioning the teachings of his people. They had always viewed the humans as weak because they valued life in ways the Cruxer didn't. But what if it wasn't weakness at all? What if there was strength in valuing each other, in fighting not just for oneself but for the group as a whole? The thought gnawed at him, an uncomfortable challenge to everything he had believed. One day, as the sun dipped low, casting a soft orange light across the horizon, the medic sat beside him. The human had spent the most time with him, quietly tending to his wounds, ensuring his recovery. There was a bond forming, though it was still tentative, built mostly on necessity. The medic had a way of speaking that was gentle but firm, as if explaining things to him was part of the process of healing, not just physically but mentally as well. The alien had been resistant at first, unwilling to engage in what he saw as idle conversation. But over time, he had started to listen. The stories the medic told him about Earth, about the wars they had fought, about the people they had lost, these were things that resonated with the warrior in a way he hadn't expected. There was a depth to these humans, a strength in their endurance, in their ability to keep fighting, not just for victory but for each other. One evening, the medic spoke of loyalty. How, in human culture, loyalty was not just about duty but about a bond, something that tied people together beyond the battlefield. "We don't leave our own behind," the medic had said, looking at the alien with a quiet intensity. "Even when it's hard. Even when it costs us." The words hung in the air, their weight pressing down on the alien warrior. He had been left behind. Cast aside like debris by his own people, who valued only what was strong, what was useful. Loyalty was not a concept he had ever associated with his kind. Cruxers served as long as they were strong, but the moment they faltered, they were discarded. It was a harsh system, one he had accepted without question, until now. The alien found himself speaking, his voice rough from disuse. He told the medic of his people, of how strength was the only thing that mattered, how anything less than perfection was seen as failure. It was not a complaint, just a statement of fact. It was the way of his kind, and he had never questioned it before. The medic listened carefully, not interrupting, absorbing the alien's words. When the alien finished, there was a long silence between them, the crackle of a distant fire the only sound in the night. Finally, the medic spoke, his voice low and thoughtful. "Your people are strong, no doubt about that. But strength comes in many forms. We fight for survival, too. But we don't do it alone. We're stronger together, even when we're weak." The alien warrior mulled over the words, feeling a strange conflict brewing inside him. The Cruxer valued independence, self-sufficiency. To rely on others was to admit weakness. But these humans, they relied on each other, and thrived because of it. Could it be that they were right? That true strength wasn't just about personal power but about the ability to care for others, to work as a unit? In the days that followed, he watched the humans more closely. He saw how they supported one another in small ways, sharing food, helping to lift burdens, offering words of encouragement when someone faltered. It was all so foreign to him, and yet, he couldn't help but feel drawn to it. There was a power in their unity, a power that didn't come from violence or domination but from something deeper, something more enduring. He began to talk more, slowly opening up about his own culture. He told them of the Cruxers' battles, their victories, their cold efficiency. But as he spoke, he could hear the emptiness in his own words. For all the strength his people possessed, there was something missing, a sense of purpose beyond survival, beyond conquest. The humans, in turn, shared more of their own stories. They spoke of families waiting for them back home, of friends lost in the war, of sacrifices made for the greater good. It was a perspective the alien had never considered before. That strength could lie in protecting others, in fighting not just for yourself but for something greater. As the days wore on, the alien began to feel the stirrings of change within him. His body was healing, but so too was his mind. He wasn't sure what to make of it yet, wasn't sure if he could ever fully embrace the human way of thinking. But one thing was clear, the values he had lived by, the cold, ruthless strength of the Cruxer, no longer seemed as certain as they once had. The wind carried the sound of distant footsteps, barely audible over the rustle of the dying battlefield. At first, the alien warrior thought it was his mind playing tricks on him, a remnant of the war that still echoed in his bones. But then, he caught the unmistakable rhythm of movement, too precise to be anything but his own kind. The Cruxer were returning. He stiffened, his senses sharpening. They were close, too close. His comrades had realized he hadn't died, and now they were back to finish what they had started. He listened carefully, straining to catch their hushed voices. Through the chatter, he discerned their plan. They weren't just here for him, they knew the humans were nearby, and they intended to strike, wiping out the small squad that had saved him. The alien's heart pounded. His first instinct was to run. He could join them, disappear back into the ranks of his people, reclaim his place among the Cruxer. They wouldn't ask questions. All they cared about was that he was still useful, still strong. He could survive. It was what he had been trained for, to preserve himself at all costs. But as he glanced at the humans around him, his stomach twisted. They didn't know what was coming. The humans were huddled around a fire, quietly discussing their next move. The medic was cleaning a weapon, his movements calm and deliberate. They were preparing for their journey forward, unaware that an ambush was imminent. The alien's mind raced. He had a choice to make. Betray them or save them. His old self, the part that had been shaped by the harsh teachings of the Cruxer, whispered that he had no obligation to these humans. They were weak. They were beneath him. What did it matter if they were slaughtered? They were just another obstacle in the Cruxer's relentless march across the galaxy. But that voice wasn't as strong as it once had been. It had grown quieter in the days he had spent with these humans. He had seen their strength, not in brute force but in their resilience, their willingness to sacrifice for one another. And more than that, they had saved him. They had risked their lives to keep him alive, even when they didn't have to. They had shown him a different kind of strength, one that challenged everything he had ever known. His loyalty to his people was still there, tugging at him, reminding him of his duty to his race. But the question lingered, did they deserve his loyalty? The same people who had left him for dead? Who valued him only when he was strong and discarded him the moment he showed weakness? Could he really go back to that? The alien's hands clenched into fists. He thought of the medic, the one human who had spent the most time with him, who had been the first to offer kindness when he expected none. The one who had told him about loyalty, about how it wasn't just about strength, but about the bonds you formed, the people you fought for. Could he really stand by and let these people die, after everything they had done for him? His mind roiled in turmoil as he paced the small shelter, the weight of his decision pressing down on him like a crushing force. If he betrayed the humans, he would return to his people, reclaim his place in their ranks. He would survive. But if he warned the humans, he would have to fight against the Cruxer. His own comrades. He would be marked as a traitor, an outcast. There would be no going back. He would be throwing away everything he had ever known. The alien couldn't breathe. His entire existence had been built on the idea that loyalty to the Cruxer was everything. But now, in this moment, he questioned what loyalty truly meant. Was it blind obedience? Or was it something more? Something that the humans seemed to understand, but that his people had never taught him? He heard footsteps behind him. It was the medic, standing in the doorway, watching him with concern. The alien knew he had to speak now. There was no time left. The Cruxer were coming. He turned to the medic, the words catching in his throat. For a moment, he considered keeping the knowledge to himself, letting the humans fall into the ambush. But when he looked at the medic's face, saw the trust in his eyes, something inside him broke. "They're coming," the alien said, his voice hoarse. "My people, they're coming for you." The medic blinked, the words sinking in. "How many?" "Enough to kill you all." The room went silent. The other humans overheard and began to move, tension thickening the air. There was no time for questions. No time for accusations. The alien expected the humans to turn on him, to question his motives, to accuse him of leading them into a trap. But they didn't. Instead, they began preparing for the battle that was now inevitable. Weapons were checked, supplies gathered, strategies whispered in hushed tones. The alien stood there, feeling more alone than he ever had in his life. He had warned them, yes, but that wasn't enough. He knew what would happen if he didn't make a choice. His people would slaughter the humans. His comrades were ruthless, far more powerful and better equipped. The humans wouldn't stand a chance on their own. The medic looked at him then, his eyes locking with the alien's. There was no anger there, no fear. Only a quiet understanding. The medic spoke, his voice steady. "You don't owe us anything. You can still leave." The alien's heart pounded in his chest. The words gave him an out, a chance to walk away and survive. But survival didn't feel like enough anymore. Not after everything he had seen, everything he had felt. He looked at the humans, at the medic, and made his choice. "I'm staying," he said, the words surprising even himself. The medic nodded, and together they prepared for the fight that was coming. The alien knew what this decision meant. There would be no returning to the Cruxer. No place for him among his own kind. He had chosen a different path, one that would likely lead to his death. But in that moment, as he stood beside the humans, readying for battle, he felt something new. He didn't feel weak. He felt stronger than he ever had before. Stronger, because for the first time in his life, he wasn't fighting just for himself. The Cruxer struck swiftly, emerging from the darkness with the efficiency and ruthlessness that had made them feared across the galaxy. The human camp was caught off guard, but they responded quickly, weapons raised, taking defensive positions. The alien warrior, standing amidst them, felt the familiar rush of battle surge through him. But this time, something was different. His mind wasn't focused on survival alone. He was fighting for them, for the humans who had risked everything for him. His former comrades moved with precision, their battle formation perfect, every strike intended to kill. They had no mercy, no hesitation, not even for one of their own. He recognized some of their faces, the same warriors who had once fought alongside him. Now they saw him as an obstacle, an enemy who had to be eliminated. There was no time for regret or sentiment. This was the Cruxer way. But the alien warrior had made his choice. With a roar, he launched himself into the fray, his body moving instinctively, channeling all the years of training and discipline that had been drilled into him since birth. His claws tore through the air, meeting the cold metal of Cruxer armor. Every strike was lethal, but his purpose had changed. It was no longer about proving his strength, or earning his place among his people. It was about protecting something greater. The humans. The humans fought beside him, their faces grim with determination, but there was no fear in their eyes. They had faced worse odds before, and they fought now as they always did, with grit, with unity. He saw it in the way they covered each other, how they moved as one, despite being outnumbered and outgunned. The Cruxer were relentless, but the humans were something more, unyielding. A Cruxer soldier rushed him, blade raised high, but the alien moved faster, disarming his opponent with brutal efficiency. He could feel the weight of his people's eyes on him, could sense their shock. They had expected him to be weak, broken. They had expected him to die. But he was no longer fighting on their terms. His strength had evolved, fueled not just by raw power but by the connection he had forged with the humans. He glanced toward the medic, who was providing cover for the others while tending to the wounded. The medic had trusted him, had treated him like more than just an enemy, and that trust burned in him now, giving him the will to fight harder than he ever had before. He had once thought loyalty was for the weak, a burden that only slowed warriors down. But now he understood that it wasn't a burden, it was what made him strong. The Cruxer began to fall back, their numbers thinning under the onslaught of the human counterattack. They weren't used to facing such resistance, especially from what they considered a weaker species. But these humans had something the Cruxer couldn't understand. They fought not just for survival but for each other, and that made them dangerous in ways his people had never anticipated. One of his former comrades, a captain, someone who had led countless successful campaigns, locked eyes with him across the battlefield. The recognition was immediate. The captain hesitated for only a moment before charging, weapon drawn, intent on finishing what had been started when the alien warrior was left for dead. The alien met the captain's charge head-on, their weapons clashing in a fury of sparks and raw power. This was the ultimate test, the moment that would decide everything. He could feel the captain's strength, the same brutal force that had been the hallmark of their people. But the alien fought with something more now. The strength of purpose, of loyalty, of having something worth fighting for beyond his own survival. The battle between them was fierce, each blow driving the alien deeper into his new understanding. The captain fought with the cold precision of a Cruxer warrior, but the alien's strikes were fueled by more than muscle memory. He was fighting for the humans, for the medic who had saved him, for the future he had chosen. It was a fight not just for his life, but for the person he had become. With one final, devastating strike, the alien disarmed the captain, sending him to the ground. He stood over his fallen comrade, breath heavy, claws dripping with blood. The captain glared up at him, defiant, unwilling to admit defeat even in his final moments. The alien stared down at him, his mind racing with everything he had learned, everything he had lost, and everything he had gained. For a moment, he considered sparing the captain, showing him the same mercy the humans had shown him. But he knew that there would be no understanding between them. The Cruxer did not change. With a swift, final blow, the alien ended the captain's life. The battle was over. The battlefield fell silent, the last of the Cruxer retreating into the shadows, leaving the alien warrior and the humans standing victorious. But victory had come at a cost. The medic was kneeling beside one of the fallen soldiers, grief etched on his face. Others gathered around their wounded, their faces reflecting both relief and sorrow. They had won, but not without loss. The alien stood among them, bloodied but alive, and for the first time in his life, he felt a deep, unfamiliar sense of belonging. He had fought for something larger than himself, something his people could never understand. In the aftermath of the battle, he saw the strength in the humans, not in their ability to kill, but in their ability to endure, to protect one another no matter the cost. The humans began to regroup, tending to the wounded and gathering their dead. The alien watched as they mourned their losses, the way they held each other up, even in their darkest moments. It was a strength that went beyond the battlefield, a strength that came from the bonds they shared. He knew now that he could never return to his people. The Cruxer had abandoned him, and he had abandoned their way of life. But he was not lost. He had found something else, something far more powerful than he had ever known. These humans, with their compassion and loyalty, had given him a new purpose. As the sun began to rise over the horizon, the alien stood alongside the humans, no longer an outsider, no longer defined by the ruthless creed of his people. He was a warrior still, but one shaped by new values. He had found strength not in isolation, but in unity. And for the first time in his life, he felt truly strong. Looking up at the stars, the alien felt a sense of peace. The future was uncertain, the war far from over, but he knew now where he stood. He would fight for the humans, for the bonds they had forged together. His past was behind him, and ahead lay a new path, one defined by loyalty, honor, and the strength of compassion.